The Forgotten Survivor. The deep space scanner beeped steadily as Captain Elias Kane leaned forward in his seat. His ship, the Wayfarer, floated silently in the darkness of space, its sensors locked onto a single signal. Weak, old, but still repeating. "Is anyone out there?" The voice in the transmission was small, tired. Elias frowned. The timestamp showed that the signal had been transmitting for 20 years. How did no one find this before? He muttered to himself. He checked the coordinates. The signal came from a barren planet on the edge of known space, a place long forgotten by most civilizations. No known colonies, no active trade routes, just an empty, dead world. A part of him hesitated. A 20-year-old distress signal meant two possibilities. Whoever sent it was dead, or they had been waiting for far too long. Elias took a breath and guided his ship toward the planet, landing on a dead world. As the Wayfarer broke through the planet's atmosphere, thick clouds swirled across the sky. The landscape below was harsh, rocky cliffs, dry riverbeds, and cracked earth stretching for miles. No signs of life. His ship landed near the source of the signal. Dust blew across the windshield as he powered down the engines. Elias grabbed his helmet, strapped on his survival gear, and stepped outside. The air was thin, barely breathable. His boots crunched against the dry ground as he moved forward. His scanner beeped again. The signal was close. He walked carefully, scanning his surroundings. There were old footprints in the dirt, long faded but still visible. Someone had lived here once. Then he saw it, a small shelter built from scrap metal and broken ship parts. It was quiet, too quiet. Elias approached, his hand near his sidearm. The door to the shelter was slightly open. He pushed it gently. Inside, the space was barely big enough for a single person. A rusted comm device sat on a table, still blinking with a weak red light. The same distress signal still broadcasting after all these years. Someone had been here. But where were they now? The shadow in the dust. A shiver ran down Elias's spine. He turned slowly, scanning the empty landscape. Then, out of the corner of his eye, something moved. A shadow. It disappeared behind a rock. Elias stepped forward cautiously. "Hello." Silence. He took another step. His scanner beeped. A life form detected. He turned just in time to see her. A thin figure stood a few feet away, half hidden by the rocks. Her skin was pale blue, her long dark hair wild and unkempt. Her clothes were torn, patched together from scraps. Her sharp golden eyes locked onto him, filled with something between fear and anger. She wasn't afraid of him. She was angry. "You finally came," she said. Her voice was hoarse, dry, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. Elias took a slow step forward, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I received your distress call," he said calmly. "I didn't know anyone was here." The girl's expression hardened. "You left me here." Elias frowned. "I wasn't the one, Bo. Humans." She spat the word like poison. "You watched. You never came. You let me suffer for 20 years. Her breathing was heavy, her hands clenched into fists. She looked ready to fight, even in her weakened state. Elias hesitated. He had no idea what had happened to her. He had never heard of this planet before today. But to her, he wasn't just a stranger. He was a symbol of everyone who had ignored her cries for help. Her golden eyes burned with emotion. "You left me alone," she whispered. "Now tell me, why should I trust you now?" Elias had no answer. For the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't here to rescue someone. He was here to face the weight of a forgotten promise, and he had no idea if she would let him live long enough to make things right. A past of betrayal. Elias Kane stood frozen, the weight of the girl's words pressing down on him like the gravity of a dying star. "You left me here." The wind howled through the barren landscape, kicking up dust around them. The girl's golden eyes never wavered, locked onto him with a fury that had been building for 2 decades. Elias took a slow breath. "I didn't know." She scoffed, crossing her arms. You didn't know. Typical human excuse. She turned away from him, her body tense, as if she expected him to attack at any moment. My name is Elias. He tried again. What's yours? Silence. She finally spoke, voice raw. Nia. Elias let the name settle in his mind. This girl, Nia, had survived alone on this desolate rock for 20 years. Can you tell me what happened? He asked, keeping his voice calm. Nia stiffened. Why should I? He sighed. Because I need to understand. If I don't know the truth, how can I help? Her fingers twitched, her breathing unsteady. She glanced at the sky, as if searching for something that was no longer there. Then finally, she spoke. Left to die. I was 6 when they abandoned me, she said. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. My people were at war, she continued, her voice distant, like she was recalling a nightmare she had long stopped fighting. The war wasn't going well. Resources were low. The elders decided. Sacrifices had to be made. Elias clenched his jaw. Sacrifices. Nia's expression twisted with bitterness. The weak. The unwanted. The useless. She took a shaky breath. I was different. Too small. Too sickly. They said I wouldn't survive anyway. So they left me here. Alone. A heavy silence settled between them. Elias struggled to find the right words. What could he possibly say to that? Nia turned to him, her face unreadable. And you know what the worst part was? He waited. She stepped closer, eyes burning. Humans knew. Elias's stomach dropped. What? She laughed, but there was no joy in it. I saw your ships, your satellites, your signals. You watched my planet burn from a distance. You saw the war. You knew. But no one helped. No one ever came. Elias felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had heard stories of war in this sector, but he had never known the details. The official records always painted humans as neutral observers, unwilling to interfere in alien conflicts. But to Nia, humanity's inaction was a death sentence. You could have saved me, she whispered. You didn't. Elias exhaled slowly. Nia, I swear to you, I didn't know. Not about you. Not about this. Her eyes flickered with something. Doubt. Hope. It was gone too quickly for him to tell. Doesn't change anything, she muttered. I survived without you. Her legs wobbled slightly, her body betraying the truth. You're starving, Elias said. She tensed. I'm fine. You're not. He unhooked a ration pack from his belt and tossed it toward her. It landed in the dirt between them. She eyed it warily. I don't need your pity. It's not pity, he said. It's food. She didn't move. Take it, he insisted. Or don't. But I'm not leaving you here alone again. Something in her expression shifted. She hesitated, then slowly crouched down, picking up the ration pack. She didn't open it. Not yet. You're not like the others, are you? She asked. Elias met her gaze. No. For the first time, her eyes softened. Just a little. A test of trust. Nia led him to her shelter, though she kept her distance. Inside, the space was barely large enough for both of them. Elias noticed the crude repairs she had made over the years. Patched walls, a small fire pit, a pile of old cloth that must have served as her bed. She sat against the wall, still holding the ration pack, but making no move to eat. Elias watched her carefully. He had spent years exploring the edges of space, meeting alien species with customs both strange and familiar. But Nia, she was different. She was alone. No species, no allies, no home. He leaned back against the opposite wall. Why did you keep the distress signal running for so long? Nia's fingers tightened around the food. I stopped believing anyone would come after the first 5 years. Then why keep it on? She stared at the blinking red light on the old comm device. Because if I turned it off, it would mean I had given up. Elias swallowed hard. 20 years of loneliness, of silence. He took a deep breath. "Well, I'm here now." She glanced at him, uncertain. "You say that now," she whispered, "but people always leave." Her words struck deep. Elias had no answer, no promises to make. All he could do was stay. The night and the warning. Outside, the wind howled against the shelter. The temperature dropped quickly, and Elias pulled his jacket tighter. Nia finally opened the ration pack, taking slow, cautious bites. "You're not staying," she said between mouthfuls. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She chewed thoughtfully. "Because the others will come soon." His heart skipped a beat. "Others?" She nodded. "The ones who left me. They come sometimes, looking for something buried here. They think I don't know." Elias straightened. "Are they dangerous?" Nia smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "They abandoned a child to die," she said. "What do you think?" Elias exhaled sharply. This mission had just changed. He wasn't here just to rescue a survivor. He was standing in the middle of something much bigger. And if what Nia said was true, they weren't alone on this planet anymore. The hunt begins. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you wonder if warmth had ever existed at all. Elias Kane sat near the dying embers of a small fire inside Nia's shelter, his mind racing. She was asleep now, curled up against the wall with her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Even in sleep, she looked ready to fight, her body tense, her face drawn. Outside, the wind howled against the metal walls. But it wasn't the wind that made Elias uneasy. It was Nia's last words before she fell asleep. "The ones who left me. They come sometimes." The way she said it, casual, almost indifferent, sent a chill through him. Whoever they were, Nia had stopped fearing them long ago. And that was almost more terrifying than if she had been afraid. Elias checked his rifle, making sure it was ready. If they were coming, he would be ready too. Footsteps in the dark. The first sign of trouble came just before dawn. Elias had dozed off, his exhaustion catching up with him. But something pulled him from sleep. A sound. Crunch. His eyes snapped open. The fire had burned out, leaving the shelter in darkness. Crunch. A footstep. Not his. Not Nia's. Elias grabbed his rifle and moved silently toward the entrance. Through a gap in the metal, he saw movement. 3 figures. They moved carefully, their silhouettes barely visible against the dim blue light of the sky. Their armor was sleek, their weapons drawn. Elias's grip tightened. They weren't scavengers. They were hunters. Behind him, Nia stirred. She made no sound, but he felt her presence. "They're early," she whispered. Elias didn't look away from the approaching figures. "You knew they were coming." She exhaled slowly. "I hoped I was wrong." "Who are they?" Nia hesitated. Then, finally, she answered. "My people." Elias felt a flicker of anger. "The same ones who abandoned you." She nodded. "They never cared about me. They left me here because I wasn't worth saving, but they didn't leave empty-handed." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" She clenched her jaw. "This planet. It's not just a graveyard. There's something buried here, something they need, and they're willing to kill for it." Elias took a deep breath. "Then we need to move. Now." The escape. They slipped out the back of the shelter, keeping low. The cold bit at Elias's skin, but he ignored it. Nia moved with practiced silence, leading him through a narrow path between the rocks. "Where are we going?" Elias whispered. She didn't stop. "To higher ground. If they find the shelter empty, they'll spread out. We'll have a better chance of surviving if we see them before they see us." Elias followed without question. Minutes passed. Then a voice, sharp, commanding, cut through the silence. "Find her. She couldn't have gone far." Elias risked a glance back. The 3 hunters had reached the shelter. One of them kicked the door open. A moment later, a second voice cursed. She was here. The fire's still warm. The first voice spoke again. Search the area. And be quiet. If she's still alive, she won't be alone. Elias felt Nia tense beside him. They know you're here, she murmured. Yeah, Elias muttered. I figured that part out. They kept moving. The cliff's edge. After nearly half an hour of silent running, Nia led Elias to a high ridge overlooking the valley. The sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the land. Elias scanned the horizon. How many of them usually come? Nia's face was unreadable. It's never the same. Sometimes 2, sometimes 5. But they always come with weapons. They don't want anyone interfering. Interfering with what? She hesitated. Digging. Elias frowned. Digging for what? Nia turned away, her expression dark. You don't want to know, she said. Elias sighed. You keep saying that, but I think I do. She let out a slow breath. If we survive this, I'll tell you. Before he could press further, a distant sound made them both freeze. A ship. Low, rumbling. Coming fast. Elias looked up. A sleek black vessel cut through the sky, heading straight for the valley. Nia swore under her breath. They're bringing more. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle. Then we need a new plan. Nia turned to face him fully, her golden eyes locked onto his. For 20 years, I ran from them, she said. But I think it's time I stop running. Elias studied her face. She wasn't scared. She was angry. And he realized, this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about revenge. The first strike. Elias adjusted his rifle. You got a plan? Nia smirked. I know this land better than they do. They may have weapons, but we have the advantage. She pointed toward the valley below. There's an old shipwreck near the ravine. If we get there first, we can set a trap. Elias nodded. Lead the way. They moved quickly, their footsteps silent against the rocky terrain. Behind them, the black ship landed. More figures emerged, 6 this time, heavily armed. Elias's heart pounded. This wasn't just a scouting party. They had come to end this. Nia's pace quickened. We don't have much time. Elias followed, adrenaline surging through his veins. Whatever Nia was planning, he knew one thing for certain. The hunters had come for her. But this time, she wasn't the prey. She was the one hunting them. Trust is earned, not given. The cold wind bit at Elias's skin as he followed Nia across the rocky terrain. The sun had risen now, casting harsh light over the barren landscape. His boots crunched against the dry earth, but Nia's steps were nearly silent. She moved like a ghost, blending into the environment, as if she had always been a part of it. Elias wasn't sure if she even realized how different she was from most people. But then again, 20 years of survival alone would change anyone. Behind them, the black ship loomed in the valley, and the hunters had begun their search. Elias could hear their distant voices, barking orders, scanning the land. Nia wasn't afraid of them. She was angry. Elias adjusted his rifle, watching her closely. You sure about this plan? She didn't stop. You have a better one. Elias sighed. Not really. Then shut up and keep moving. He smirked. You've got a great way of making people feel welcome, you know that. She didn't answer. Because in her mind, trust wasn't something given. It was something earned. The wreck in the ravine. The terrain grew rougher as they reached the edge of the ravine. Jagged rocks jutted out from the cliffside, and far below, the skeletal remains of a shipwreck stretched across the valley floor. It was massive, a rusted warship, long forgotten, half buried under the weight of time. Elias let out a low whistle. This thing's ancient. Nia nodded. Crashed here long before I was born. My people thought it was useless junk. Elias narrowed his eyes. But you don't. She shook her head. I know the truth. There's something inside it. Something they're willing to kill for." Elias frowned. "And you want to use it against them?" Her golden eyes gleamed. "That's the idea." Elias exhaled. "All right. What's inside?" Nia hesitated. Then, slowly, she answered, "An old power source." Elias raised an eyebrow. "How old?" She glanced at the wreckage below. "Older than my people. Older than yours." A strange chill ran down his spine. "Sounds dangerous." She smirked. "Good. Let's go." And without another word, she slid down the rocky slope, disappearing into the wreckage below. Elias sighed and followed. Inside the warship, the wreck smelled of rust and decay. The walls were covered in scorch marks, remnants of a battle fought long ago. Broken machinery littered the floor, twisted metal, and shattered glass crunching beneath their boots. Elias swept his flashlight across the corridor. "Where's this power source?" Nia moved ahead without hesitation. "Deep in the core. They never got to it, because they didn't think it still worked." Elias frowned. "And what makes you think it does?" She stopped and turned to him. "Because I've been here before." Elias's eyes widened. "You've been inside this ship?" She nodded. "A long time ago. When I was younger, I searched every inch of this planet looking for something. Anything that could get me off this rock." Her fingers trailed against the cold metal walls. "I found this place. I found it." Elias crossed his arms. "And?" She turned back to face him. It was still alive. Elias felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Before he could respond, a noise echoed through the ship. A low thud. Then another. Nia's expression darkened. "They're here." Elias raised his rifle. "How many?" She closed her eyes for a brief moment, listening. Then she opened them. "All of them." The first strike. The ship groaned as the hunters entered from the far end of the corridor. Their armored boots clanked against the metal floor, their weapons scanning the dark. Elias and Nia crouched behind a fallen piece of debris, hidden in the shadows. Nia whispered, "They don't know where we are yet. We can still control the fight." Elias nodded. "All right. What's the plan?" She smirked. "We set a trap." Before Elias could respond, she grabbed a small rusted metal panel from the floor and threw it down the hallway. The clang echoed through the ship. The hunters immediately snapped to attention, weapons aimed at the noise. "There! Move in!" one of them barked. The team split into two, half of them moving toward the sound while the others held back. Nia leaned in close. "Now." Elias didn't need to be told twice. He raised his rifle and fired. The first shot hit home, slamming into the lead hunter's armor, knocking him off balance. The second shot took down the next one before he could react. Nia moved like lightning, lunging from the shadows, grabbing a blade from her belt and driving it into the third hunter's side. The remaining two reacted fast, but Elias was faster. He dropped one with a well-placed shot. The last one bolted. Nia didn't hesitate. She chased after him, her speed unnatural, her footsteps silent as death. Elias swore under his breath and ran after her. The final confrontation. The last hunter ran into a sealed chamber at the heart of the ship. Elias and Nia followed, weapons raised. Inside, the air hummed with something ancient. And there, at the center of the room, it stood, a glowing orb pulsing with energy, encased in old machinery, wires coiling around it like vines. The power source. The hunter turned, gun raised. "Stay back." Nia didn't stop. She lunged, knocking the weapon from his hands, slamming him against the wall. Elias pointed his rifle at the man's head. Not so fast. The hunter struggled, but Nia held him firm. She leaned in close, her voice deadly. "You abandoned me. You left me to die." The hunter's face twisted with fear. I didn't." Nia didn't let him finish. She knocked him unconscious with a single strike. Then, slowly, she turned to Elias. "I told you they never cared about me." Elias lowered his rifle. He looked at the glowing orb, at Nia, and at the fallen hunters. He exhaled. This isn't over, is it? Nia smirked. Not even close. She stepped toward the power source, her eyes reflecting its golden glow. Elias had a bad feeling about this. Whatever this thing was, it was ancient, and now, for the first time in 20 years, it had someone to wield it. The rescue mission. The energy pulsing from the ancient orb filled the chamber with a faint hum. It was old, older than Nia's people, older than humanity's first steps into space. The glow of it reflected in Nia's golden eyes as she stood before it, motionless. Elias watched her carefully. The air in the chamber felt charged, like the calm before a storm. He adjusted his grip on his rifle. Nia, I don't like this. She didn't move. I don't care. Her voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in it. Elias took a cautious step forward. You said your people come here to dig. Is this what they're after? She nodded. They think it's a weapon. Elias frowned. Is it? Nia let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. Not exactly. It's something more. Elias wasn't sure he wanted to know what more meant. But before he could ask, the ship shook. A deep, thunderous explosion echoed through the walls. Elias spun toward the entrance. What was that? Nia's expression darkened. Reinforcements. Another explosion rocked the ship, dust and metal debris falling from the ceiling. The walls groaned under the impact. Elias's stomach twisted. We need to move. Now. Nia didn't answer right away. She was still staring at the glowing orb, her fingers twitching at her side. Elias clenched his jaw. Whatever this thing was, it was calling to her. And that terrified him more than the hunters outside. The battle above. They climbed out of the wreckage just as another explosion rocked the valley. Elias's eyes widened. A second ship had landed, bigger than the first. Its engine still hummed as figures poured out, weapons raised. Nia's former people. Except this time, they weren't just a scouting party. They had brought an army. Elias ducked behind a rock, scanning the battlefield. This isn't just about you anymore, he muttered. They want the power source. Nia crouched beside him, her jaw clenched. They'll burn this planet down if they have to. Elias cursed. Do you have any allies? Someone who cooled? No, she cut him off. I was abandoned, remember? He sighed. Right. Nia's golden eyes flickered toward the approaching soldiers. I'll handle them, she said. Elias's head snapped toward her. Excuse me. She stood, rolling her shoulders. I'm tired of running. Elias grabbed her wrist before she could move. You're outnumbered 20-1. She smirked. They don't know what I found. He exhaled sharply. You're going to use the power source, aren't you? She didn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. She already was. The first strike. The soldiers moved in carefully, scanning the terrain with sharp, focused precision. They weren't fools. They knew their prey was still alive. Then the ground trembled. A sudden pulse of golden light erupted from behind the rocks. Elias shielded his eyes as the shockwave rippled outward. Then, in the middle of the battlefield, Nia walked forward. Alone. No weapon. No armor. Just her. The soldiers hesitated. Their leader, a tall figure in dark armor, stepped forward, weapon raised. Nia, he said, his voice laced with condescension. We assumed you were dead by now. Nia didn't stop moving. Her expression was unreadable. You should have made sure. The leader chuckled. You always were a stubborn one, but this doesn't have to be violent. Give us what we came for, and maybe we'll let you live. Nia tilted her head. You abandoned me. The leader sighed. We made a choice. You weren't worth the resources. You should be grateful we let you. A wave of energy exploded from Nia's hands. It wasn't fire. It wasn't lightning. It was something else. Something ancient. Something terrifying. The force sent the leader flying, crashing into a jagged rock with a sickening crack. Silence. Then, chaos. The soldiers opened fire. Elias moved fast, raising his rifle and taking down the first shooter. The air filled with the sharp cracks of gunfire, but Nea didn't flinch. She moved like a ghost, weaving through the chaos, energy crackling around her fingertips. One soldier lunged toward her. She raised a hand, and he froze midair, his body suspended in golden light. Then she threw him aside like a rag doll. Elias's heart pounded. This wasn't just survival. This was retribution. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he should be more afraid of the enemy or of Nea. The choice. By the time the dust settled, only 3 soldiers remained. They had dropped their weapons. The battlefield was littered with the fallen. Some unconscious, some worse. Elias lowered his rifle, breathing heavily. Well, that was one way to handle it. Nea stood in the center of it all, her hands still glowing faintly with energy. The soldiers watched her with fear. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the abandoned girl. She was the one in control. The leader groaned from where he had fallen, coughing up blood. Nea approached slowly. This is the part where you beg, isn't it? He spat at the ground. Go to hell. She considered that. Then, slowly, she raised her hand, energy swirling at her fingertips. Elias stepped forward. Nea. She didn't look at him. You don't have to do this, he said carefully. Her fingers twitched. Why not? Because if you kill him, you become them. That made her pause. The air between them crackled with tension. Then, after a long, slow breath, she lowered her hand. The energy flickered out. The leader exhaled shakily. Nea turned to Elias. We need to leave. Elias nodded. Agreed. They turned toward the Wayfarer, the only way off this forsaken planet. As they climbed aboard, Nea glanced back at the battlefield one last time. For 20 years, she had dreamed of escaping. Now, for the first time, she wasn't just running away. She was choosing her own future. And this time, she wasn't alone. The battle for redemption. The air inside the Wayfarer was thick with tension. The ship's engines hummed as Elias prepped for takeoff, his fingers moving quickly across the control panel. But behind him, Nea stood rigid, her golden eyes fixed on the battlefield they were about to leave behind. Outside, the survivors of the enemy force were regrouping. The ones who could still move were dragging the wounded back to their ship. The rest lay motionless, their weapons abandoned, their faces filled with fear. Fear of her. Elias exhaled, gripping the controls. We don't have much time. More of them could show up any second. Nea didn't answer. She was still watching, still listening. Elias turned in his seat. Nea. Slowly, she looked at him. He could see it in her face. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about finishing it. And Elias wasn't sure if that was a good thing. A ghost of the past. They'll keep coming, she said softly. Elias frowned. What? Her hands clenched into fists. They don't leave loose ends. If we leave now, they'll track us. They'll never stop hunting me. Elias ran a hand through his hair. All right. Then we make sure they can't follow. Nea turned back to the viewport, her gaze locked on the wreckage of the warship below. No, she said. That's not enough. Elias's stomach twisted. Nea, what are you thinking? She took a slow breath. Then, without a word, she turned and walked toward the cargo hold. Elias swore under his breath and followed. By the time he caught up, she was already strapping a harness around her waist. She grabbed a long rusted metal case and slung it over her shoulder. Elias crossed his arms. I get the feeling I'm not going to like whatever's in there. She smirked. Probably not. Mind telling me anyway. She lifted the lid just enough for him to see. Elias's eyes widened. That's a warhead, she confirmed. Old tech, but still functional. Elias let out a long breath. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? She snapped the case shut. Let's just say I've had a lot of time to think. Elias hesitated. Nia, you don't have to do this. She met his gaze. Yes, I do. And then she was gone. The descent into fire. Elias sprinted to the cockpit, watching as Nia disappeared into the wreckage below. A part of him wanted to stop her. A part of him knew he couldn't. She had spent 20 years waiting for this moment, and he wasn't sure if anything could change her mind. Through the ship's scanners, he tracked her movement as she slipped through the shadows, making her way toward the enemy's landing zone. The second ship, the one that had arrived as reinforcements, was still there, its engines running, ready to take off at a moment's notice. If she planted the warhead near their fuel cells, the resulting explosion would take the entire site with it, including the wrecked warship, including the ancient power source, including her. Elias cursed and activated his comms. Nia, listen to me. You don't need to do this alone. Static. Then, after a long pause, her voice crackled through. I was alone for a long time. Elias gritted his teeth. You're not anymore. Another pause. Then softly. Then prove it. The final stand. Elias grabbed his rifle and ran. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have time for one. All he knew was that if Nia was going to face this alone, then he would stand beside her. The moment he stepped outside, gunfire erupted. The remaining enemy soldiers spotted him immediately, shouting orders, moving into position. Elias dived for cover, rolling behind a jagged rock as bullets and plasma fire cut through the air. He peeked out, firing 2 quick shots. One hit home, dropping the soldier instantly. The second shot went wide, slamming into the side of their ship. He reloaded. Nia, where are you? Her voice came through the comms. Almost there. Elias gritted his teeth. Hurry. He popped out of cover again, squeezing off another few rounds. A shot grazed his shoulder, burning hot against his skin. He bit back a curse and kept moving. Then, out of nowhere, a pulse of golden energy erupted across the battlefield. The soldiers froze. Elias turned just in time to see Nia standing at the edge of the wreckage. The warhead was armed, and in her other hand, the power source pulsed with light. For a moment, the battlefield was silent. Then, the enemy leader, bleeding, barely standing, stepped forward. You don't know what you're doing, he spat. Nia's golden eyes burned. I know exactly what I'm doing. She threw the warhead. The world erupted into fire. Home at last. The explosion ripped through the valley, tearing through metal and stone like paper. Elias barely had time to react before the shockwave threw him backward, slamming him against the ground. His ears rang, his vision blurred. For a terrifying moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. The battlefield was gone. The enemy ships were nothing but twisted wreckage. The warship, the place where Nia had spent half her life hiding, was reduced to ash. And in the middle of it all, Nia stood motionless. The power source had burned out in her hands. Its glow was gone. Elias staggered toward her. Nia. She turned, and for the first time, she looked free. She blinked, as if waking from a long nightmare. Then, softly, it's over. Elias let out a breath. Yeah. A long pause. Then she smiled, and without another word, they turned toward the wayfarer, toward the stars, toward a new future, together. Home at last. The sky above was painted in deep shades of purple and gold, remnants of the explosion still fading into the distant horizon. The ground beneath Elias's boots was cracked, scorched, forever marked by the battle that had finally ended. The wreckage of the enemy ships lay scattered across the valley, black smoke curling toward the sky. And in the center of it all, Nia stood silent. Her golden eyes reflected the last flickering embers of destruction, but her expression was unreadable. Elias took a slow breath, stepping toward her. "It's done." She didn't respond right away. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I never thought I'd leave this place." Elias exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Well, you can now." A long silence stretched between them. Then, softly, "I don't know how." Elias frowned. "How what?" She turned to him, her face raw with emotion. "How to leave. How to be anything other than this." He watched her carefully. This wasn't just about the battle. This was about 20 years of loneliness. 20 years of being forgotten. 20 years of believing she had no future. Elias sighed. "You walk away." She laughed, but it was empty. "It's not that easy." "Maybe not," Elias admitted, "but you're not alone anymore." Nia hesitated. For a long time, she simply stared at him, as if trying to understand the meaning behind those words. Then, without another word, she started walking. Not away. Toward the ship. Toward the unknown. The weight of freedom. Inside the Wayfarer, the air smelled of metal and fuel. It was a stark contrast to the wild, open air of the planet she had called home for 2 decades. Nia ran her fingers along the walls of the ship, her touch hesitant, almost unsure. Elias moved toward the cockpit, flipping switches, bringing the engines online. The ship hummed beneath his feet, vibrations signaling the start of their journey. "Strap in," he called. Nia didn't move. He glanced over his shoulder. "Nia?" She was still standing in the entryway, staring at the floor. Elias softened his voice. "Hey, it's all right." She looked up at him, something fragile in her eyes. "I don't know where to sit." Elias blinked. Then, after a moment, he smiled. "Anywhere you want." She hesitated, then slowly stepped forward. Carefully, she lowered herself into the co-pilot's seat. She touched the control panel lightly, as if afraid it would disappear under her fingertips. Elias sat beside her. "First time in a ship." She nodded. "First time. Leaving." He studied her for a moment. "You scared?" She swallowed hard. "A little." Elias grinned. "Good. That's how you know you're doing something worth it." She let out a quiet breath. Then, for the first time since he met her, she truly smiled. A real, unguarded smile. "Take us up," she said. And Elias did. The stars await. The ship lifted off, breaking free from the scorched ground, the dying battlefield shrinking below them. As they ascended, the heavy atmosphere of the planet gave way to the vast, endless blackness of space. Nia watched in silent awe. She had looked at the stars her whole life, but she had never seen them like this. She reached out, pressing her fingers against the viewport, as if she could touch the endless void beyond. "I used to dream about this." Elias leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. "And?" She smiled, her golden eyes shining. "It's better than I imagined." Elias chuckled. "Yeah, space has that effect." For a while, they simply sat there, watching the stars stretch out before them. Then, finally, Elias cleared his throat. "So, where to?" Nia hesitated, looking down at her hands. "I don't know." Elias smirked. "Well, I've got good news for you." She glanced at him curiously. He turned back to the controls, flipping switches, charting a course. "There's an entire galaxy out there," he said, "and for the first time in 20 years, you get to choose where you go." Nia stared at him, processing those words. Then, slowly, her fingers curled into fists. She had been left behind, forgotten, abandoned. She had spent 2 decades surviving, waiting for a future that never came. But now, for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting anymore. She was moving forward. She took a deep breath, looking back at the vast expanse of stars. Then, softly, she said, "Somewhere new." Elias grinned. "Somewhere new it is." And with a final push of the throttle, the Wayfarer shot into the unknown, disappearing into the endless night. Mia didn't look back, because for the first time in 20 years, she was finally home.